The car Ford almost didn't build. Some cars change history because they are bold. Others matter because they were almost replaced by something safer. Before Ford committed to the Mustang as we know it, there was another path on the table, one that followed the rules, one that protected the brand, one that would have looked sensible to shareholders, engineers, and executives alike. It was not a bad idea. It was practical. It was defensible. And it nearly won. Inside Ford, the early Mustang concept did not feel inevitable. It felt exposed. It relied on assumptions that could not be fully tested. It asked the company to move faster than its normal rhythms allowed and to accept compromises that would be visible to anyone who looked closely. There were alternatives that avoided all of that. Cars that fit neatly into existing categories, cars that would not surprise insurance companies, cars that would not force uncomfortable conversations about who Ford was trying to attract and who it might alienate along the way. Those alternatives were not dismissed out of hand. They were studied, modeled, discussed seriously. For a moment, they looked like the responsible choice. That is what makes this story worth telling. Because the decision Ford faced was not between brilliance and failure, it was between uncertainty and control, between a car that would stretch the company and one that would quietly confirm what it already knew how to do. The Mustang, as an idea, asked Ford to believe that buyers would respond to emotion before performance, to appearance before optimization, and to possibility before proof. That belief was not universally shared. Many inside the company saw no reason to take that risk. Ford was profitable. Its lineup was stable. There was no emergency forcing innovation. Betting the company's reputation on a car aimed at younger buyers felt unnecessary at best and reckless at worst. And yet, something about the safer option felt hollow. It solved problems Ford already understood. It protected strengths the company already had. What it did not do was change the relationship between Ford and the people it was slowly losing. This episode is about that fork in the road. The car Ford almost built instead. The arguments that nearly stopped the Mustang before it existed. And the quiet realization that playing it safe can sometimes be the riskiest decision a company makes. To understand why Ford ultimately rejected the sensible choice, we have to start with the option that made the most sense on paper. Part 1. The sensible alternative. The alternative Ford considered did not arrive as a warning or a retreat. It arrived as a solution. Inside the company, the question was not framed as whether Ford should build something new. It was framed as how far that new needed to go. There was broad agreement that younger buyers were drifting. There was less agreement about what kind of response that drift required. One camp believed the answer was refinement, not reinvention. Ford already had compact platforms in production. It already understood how to sell affordable cars at scale. The safest path forward was to take what worked and adjust it slightly. Add styling cues, sharpen proportions, introduce modest performance upgrades. Create something that looked fresher without forcing the company to relearn how to build cars. This approach had advantages that were hard to argue against. It limited risk. It protected manufacturing discipline. It fit neatly into Ford's existing product hierarchy. Dealers would understand it. Engineers would trust it. Executives could explain it. The car that emerged from this thinking would not have been slow or unattractive. It would have been competent, respectable, and familiar in all the ways Ford valued. In many ways, it was exactly the kind of product large organizations are designed to produce. Internally, it was described less as a breakthrough and more as an extension, a way to refresh the lineup without introducing volatility, a way to address youth interest without conceding control to unpredictable taste. From a planning standpoint, it checked every box. The platform would be proven. Costs could be forecast with confidence. Timelines would be realistic. Failure would be unlikely, because the car would not ask buyers to rethink what a Ford was supposed to be. That was the appeal. Ford had built its reputation on consistency, on knowing what it did well and doing it repeatedly. The alternative car fit that identity cleanly. It did not threaten internal assumptions about who Ford served or how it operated, and importantly, it avoided embarrassment. If the Mustang concept failed publicly, it would not fail quietly. It would be visible. It would be discussed. It would invite questions about leadership judgment. The conservative alternative did not carry that risk. If it underperformed, it could be absorbed into the lineup and forgotten. It would not redefine anything, but it would not damage anything either. That kind of safety matters inside a large company, especially one still shaped by recent memory. Ford had lived through public missteps before. The company understood what it felt like to be overconfident. That history made caution feel wise rather than timid. There was also a philosophical argument behind the safer option. Cars, in this view, were not fashion. They were durable goods. They were purchased with logic, budget, and long-term use in mind. Building a car around emotional appeal rather than mechanical substance felt backward to many inside the organization. Why risk credibility chasing a feeling? Why invite comparison to performance cars Ford was not prepared to compete with directly? Why train buyers to expect excitement from a brand built on dependability? The sensible alternative avoided those questions entirely. It would give younger buyers something newer to look at without promising more than Ford could consistently deliver. It would let the company signal awareness without committing to transformation. And for a time, that argument carried real weight. Meetings were calm, discussions were measured. The alternative felt like something that could pass review without friction. It did not require anyone to defend an uncomfortable position. That is often how decisions quietly tilt, not because one idea is better, but because it is easier to approve. What complicates this story is that the alternative was not wrong. If Ford had built it, the company would likely have remained profitable. Dealerships would have continued operating normally. The product line would have evolved incrementally, as it always had. Nothing would have collapsed, which is precisely the problem. The conservative car would not have failed loudly enough to force reflection. It would have blended into the background of American roads. It would have satisfied existing customers without creating new ones. It would have solved Ford's operational concerns while leaving the cultural problem untouched. Younger buyers were not drifting because Ford's cars were unreliable or poorly priced. They were drifting because those cars did not speak to them. The safer option did not change that. It spoke the same language, just with a slightly different accent. Inside Ford, a few people recognized this, even as the alternative gained momentum. They saw that the proposal treated relevance as a surface issue rather than a structural one. The question was not whether the car would sell. The question was whether it would matter. That distinction was harder to defend in meetings. It did not lend itself to charts or forecasts. It sounded subjective in a company trained to trust measurable outcomes. Still, the unease persisted. The conservative option made sense if Ford's goal was stability. It made less sense if the goal was connection. And that tension set the stage for the next debate. Because if the safer car felt sufficient, the Mustang concept felt excessive. And understanding why so many inside Ford believed that excess was unnecessary requires looking at what the company believed it was protecting. Part 2. Why the risk looked unnecessary. From inside Ford, the risk did not look heroic. It looked avoidable. The company was not in decline. It was not fighting for survival. Its factories were running. Its dealer network was strong. Its balance sheets reflected stability, not urgency. That context shaped how every proposal was judged. When advocates for the Mustang concept argued that Ford needed to act boldly, many executives heard something else. They heard a call to disrupt a system that was still functioning. They heard a request to take reputational risk without a clear operational payoff. Why gamble when the house was not on fire? The Mustang proposal asked Ford to commit resources to a product whose appeal could not be fully modeled. It relied on assumptions about taste, identity, and aspiration. Those are not inputs. Large organizations trust easily. Costs could be estimated, but demand could not be predicted with confidence. The idea of younger buyers flocking to a car simply because it looked different felt speculative, even optimistic. From a financial perspective, the risk profile was asymmetric. If the Mustang failed, it would fail publicly. It would be associated with specific leaders and specific decisions. It would invite scrutiny from shareholders, analysts, and competitors. If it succeeded, the upside was harder to define in advance. Ford would sell more cars, but how many? And at what margin? Would those buyers stay with the brand, or would they leave as soon as something newer appeared? The safer alternative avoided that uncertainty. It offered modest gains with limited downside. It fit neatly into existing pricing structures. It could be produced using established suppliers and processes. There was also concern about brand discipline. Ford had spent decades cultivating an image of dependability and responsibility. A car marketed primarily on emotion threatened to blur that message. If Ford became known for excitement rather than trust, what happened when excitement faded? This was not abstract fear. Automotive history was full of brands that chased image and lost coherence. Ford's leadership was keenly aware of that risk. Engineering concerns added another layer. The Mustang concept depended on compromises that engineers understood clearly. Using an existing compact platform imposed limits on handling, braking, and structural balance. Those limits would not disappear simply because the car looked fast. If buyers pushed the car beyond its design envelope, Ford would bear the consequences. Warranty claims, safety scrutiny, insurance backlash, those outcomes were not hypothetical. Engineers could point to exactly where stress would appear and how public perception could shift once real-world use diverged from marketing imagery. From their perspective, caution was not resistance. It was responsibility. There was also the issue of internal precedent. Approving the Mustang would signal that emotional appeal could override engineering optimization. That message worried leaders responsible for maintaining standards across a vast product portfolio. If one team was allowed to bend the rules, others would ask to do the same. Large organizations survive by consistency. Exceptions, even successful ones, can create pressure that is difficult to manage. Then there was timing. The Mustang proposal required moving quickly. That meant shorter development cycles, compressed testing, and less opportunity to iterate. Speed introduced risk, not just in design, but in execution. Ford was good at measured progress. It was less comfortable with rapid bets. All of these concerns were reasonable. None of them were rooted in fear alone. They reflected an organization doing what it had been built to do, protect itself from unnecessary volatility. What made the debate difficult was that the Mustang advocates could not eliminate those risks. They could only argue that the risk of inaction was greater. That is a harder case to make. The absence of disaster rarely feels urgent. Drift does not announce itself with alarms. It shows up slowly, in missed connections and fading relevance. From inside Ford, the risk of doing nothing looked manageable. The company could continue refining its lineup, adjusting incrementally, and maintaining its market position. The risk of doing something bold looked disproportionate. That imbalance tilted discussions toward caution. Meetings ended without resolution. Requests for more data delayed decisions. The safer alternative continued to gain legitimacy simply by being easier to defend. This is how organizations often stall at moments of inflection, not because leaders lack vision, but because the costs of change are immediate and visible, while the costs of standing still are abstract and delayed. For many inside Ford, the Mustang felt like an answer to a question that did not yet need to be asked. Why redefine the brand when it was still working? Why invite uncertainty when stability was achievable? Those questions did not come from ignorance. They came from experience. Ford had learned repeatedly that bold moves carry long shadows. The company did not need another reminder. And so the burden shifted. If the Mustang was to survive, its advocates would need to reframe the conversation, not around what Ford might gain, but around what it stood to lose. Because until that shift happened, the risk would continue to look unnecessary, and the safer car would continue to feel like the smarter choice. Part 3. The car that would have fit right in. If Ford had chosen the safer path, the car it built would not have looked wrong. That is the most important thing to understand. It would not have been awkward or underpowered. It would not have embarrassed the company. It would have arrived on dealership lots as a logical extension of what Ford already sold, shaped by familiar proportions and familiar priorities. It would have fit. The design sketches that circulated internally during this period reflected that mindset. Compact, balanced, restrained, slightly sharper lines than existing sedans. A cleaner profile, enough visual distinction to suggest progress, but not enough to disrupt expectations. This car would not have demanded attention. It would have earned it politely. The hood would have been shorter because it did not need to imply power. The stance would have been upright because that was how Ford built cars that rode well and handled predictably. The rear seat would have been usable because practicality still mattered more than posture. From an engineering standpoint, it would have been solid. Suspension geometry would have favored comfort and stability. Weight distribution would have been sensible. Components would have been shared across the lineup to simplify service and supply chains. Nothing about it would have surprised a Ford engineer. That was the point. The interior would have reinforced the same message. A bench seat or modest buckets. A column shifter as standard. Instrumentation designed for clarity, not drama. Options would exist, but within a narrow band. Buyers would recognize it immediately as a Ford. This car would not have asked anyone to rethink what the brand represented. Marketing would have followed suit. Advertising would have emphasized value, reliability, and modern styling. The car would have been positioned as a smart choice for young families, young professionals, or anyone wanting something slightly newer without stepping outside their comfort zone. It would have been aspirational in the way Ford had always defined aspiration. Progress, not rebellion. Improvement, not reinvention. Dealers would have known exactly how to sell it. Sales conversations would have sounded familiar. Practical benefits first. Monthly payments. Trade-in logic. Long-term ownership. No one would have needed special training, and that familiarity would have produced predictable results. The car would have sold. Not explosively, not disruptively, but steadily. It would have replaced some aging models. It would have attracted a portion of younger buyers who were already inclined toward Ford. It would have preserved volume without changing the brand's gravitational center. Inside the company, it would have been declared a success. Meetings would have closed with quiet satisfaction. Forecasts would have aligned. Production would have scaled smoothly. There would have been no dealer chaos, no insurance backlash, no internal hand-wringing, and culturally, almost nothing would have shifted. This is where the cost becomes visible. The conservative car would not have created a category. It would not have forced competitors to respond. It would not have altered how Americans talked about cars. It would not have made people linger on dealership floors just to sit behind the wheel. It would not have become a symbol. That absence matters. Brands do not lose relevance all at once. They lose it by continuing to do reasonable things while the culture moves somewhere else. The almost built car spoke the same language Ford had been speaking for decades. It was fluent, polished, and increasingly ignored. Younger buyers would not have rejected it. They would have treated it the way they treated Ford's other offerings. They would have looked, nodded, moved on. That reaction is difficult to measure, but devastating over time, because what the Mustang concept threatened to do was not replace one model with another. It threatened to replace how people felt when they saw a Ford badge. The safer car did nothing to address that. It assumed that relevance could be maintained through continuity. That assumption had worked before. It was no longer guaranteed. What makes this counterfactual uncomfortable is how reasonable it remains. Even now, the conservative alternative sounds defensible. Many companies still make that choice, and many survive doing so. But survival is not the same as influence. Ford did not need another competent car. It needed a reason to be noticed. The almost built car would have delivered competence at scale and left the deeper problem untouched. That realization did not emerge all at once. It surfaced slowly in side conversations and unresolved discomfort, in the sense that something essential was missing, even if no one could yet articulate exactly what that was. The car would have fit right in. And that, ultimately, was the problem, because fitting in was exactly what Ford could no longer afford to do. That realization did not settle the debate. It changed how the debate itself was framed. Part 4. The argument that changed the vote. What finally shifted the conversation inside Ford was not a new data set or a revised forecast. It was a reframing. Up to that point, the debate had revolved around risk management, how much uncertainty the company should tolerate, how much deviation from established practice was acceptable, whether the potential upside justified the exposure. Those questions favored the conservative option by default. The breakthrough came when a few voices stopped arguing about the car and started talking about the company. They asked a different question. Not whether the Mustang concept was riskier than the alternative, but whether Ford could afford to keep proving it was still the same company it had always been. That subtle shift mattered. Instead of defending the Mustang as a product, its advocates framed it as a signal. A message to buyers, competitors, and employees about what Ford believed its future could look like. The safer car protected Ford's current position. The Mustang challenged Ford to claim a new one. That distinction was uncomfortable because it did not lend itself to easy rebuttal. Executives who favored caution could explain how the conservative option reduced exposure. They could quantify cost control. They could outline predictable outcomes. What they struggled to do was explain how Ford would regain emotional relevance without changing its posture. This is where personality entered the room. Lee Iacocca did not argue like an engineer or a finance officer. He argued like someone who understood how products live in people's heads. He talked about what buyers noticed first and what they forgot fastest. He did not deny the risks. He acknowledged them openly. Then he pointed out that Ford was already taking a risk by assuming loyalty would persist without renewal. That idea landed differently. It suggested that inaction was not neutral. It was a choice with consequences, even if those consequences arrived slowly. The Mustang proposal was reframed as a controlled risk rather than a reckless one, not a rejection of Ford's discipline, but a test of its adaptability. The argument was not that the conservative car would fail. It was that it would succeed quietly and change nothing. That quiet success began to look dangerous. Timing played a role as well. Cultural signals were shifting quickly. Imports were gaining attention. Competitors were experimenting with image and youth appeal. The longer Ford waited, the more reactive it would appear. The Mustang, even with its compromises, offered initiative. It allowed Ford to move first rather than respond later. That mattered to leadership more than it might appear on the surface. Companies that lead shape the narrative. Companies that follow explain themselves. There was also a realization that the Mustang did not have to be permanent in its initial form. If it failed, Ford could retreat. If it succeeded, Ford could evolve it. The conservative car offered no such flexibility. It would lock Ford into continuity without leverage. The final discussions were not dramatic. There was no single speech that ended the debate, no cinematic turning point. Instead, there was a gradual alignment around the idea that relevance could not be engineered incrementally anymore. The safer option no longer felt neutral. It felt like avoidance. When the decision tipped, it did so quietly. Approvals were granted. Budgets were allocated. The Mustang concept moved from debated idea to active project. Some executives remained uneasy. Some engineers remained skeptical. That did not disappear. What changed was the understanding of what Ford was willing to risk. The company chose to risk imperfection in order to regain attention. It chose to risk internal discomfort in order to re-enter the cultural conversation. That choice did not guarantee success. It guaranteed movement. And once that movement began, reversing course would have required more courage than continuing forward. By the time the paperwork was signed, the argument was effectively over. Ford had chosen the unknown, not because it was safer, but because standing still had begun to look worse. And that is how the Mustang survived the moment when it could have been replaced by something sensible. Not by winning every argument, but by changing which argument mattered. Part 5. Choosing the unknown. Once the decision tipped, there was no celebration, there was work. Choosing the Mustang concept did not feel like a leap forward. It felt like removing a safety net. The conservative alternative had offered clarity. It had offered predictability. It had offered the comfort of knowing roughly how the story would end. The Mustang offered none of that. What it offered instead was momentum. With approval in place, the project moved quickly, not because Ford suddenly became reckless, but because delay would have reopened every argument that had just been settled. Speed became a form of commitment. Every week that passed made reversal harder. That was understood by everyone involved. Budgets were finalized with the awareness that not everything could be optimized. Engineering teams worked within constraints they would normally have pushed back against. Marketing moved forward without the luxury of perfect alignment between promise and hardware. This was not how Ford preferred to operate, but it was how the decision had to be honored. Choosing the unknown required a different posture inside the company. Instead of seeking certainty before action, teams were asked to act and adjust. That shift created friction. Some processes resisted it. Some people did as well. Yet the alternative was worse. Backing away now would signal indecision. It would confirm the fears of those who believed Ford could not commit to change. It would turn the Mustang into evidence that the company lacked resolve, so Ford pressed on. What is often missed in hindsight is how provisional the early Mustang felt internally. It was not treated as a guaranteed hit. It was treated as a test that might justify further evolution if it worked. That framing mattered. The Mustang was allowed to be incomplete. It was allowed to be rough around the edges. It was allowed to rely on perception in places where engineering elegance was not yet possible. Those allowances would have been unthinkable for a core sedan or truck line. They were tolerated here because the project itself was framed as exploratory. That is the quiet power of choosing the unknown deliberately. It creates permission. Permission to ship something that is not fully resolved. Permission to learn in public. Permission to revise course without admitting failure. The conservative car would have required none of that permission because it would not have challenged anything. The Mustang did. As development continued, the company's internal language began to shift. Conversations moved away from whether the car should exist and toward how it could be made credible. That change is subtle but decisive. Once an organization starts asking how instead of whether, the outcome becomes increasingly difficult to stop. Ford crossed that line. The unknown became operational reality. There were still worries, still debates, still late-stage compromises that made people uncomfortable. But the central question had been answered. Ford was willing to move without full certainty. That willingness did not apply to everything the company did. It was specific, contextual, and bounded. But it was real, and it marked a departure from the logic that had guided the safer alternative. The Mustang was no longer competing with the conservative car. The conservative car had already lost. What remained was execution, not perfect execution, sufficient execution. Enough to see whether the market would respond, enough to justify the choice, enough to learn. Choosing the unknown did not make Ford fearless. It made Ford curious. And curiosity, once institutionalized, is difficult to contain because it does not stop with one product. It changes how future questions get asked. That is the deeper consequence of this decision. Not that Ford built a Mustang, but that it proved it could step outside its own habits without collapsing. The company did not abandon discipline. It suspended it selectively. That distinction would matter long after this car left the factory. Because once an organization demonstrates it can survive uncertainty, certainty stops being the default requirement. And that is when real change becomes possible. The Mustang carried that lesson forward, not as a manifesto, but as a precedent, one that Ford would return to, consciously or not, whenever it faced the tension between control and relevance again. The unknown had been chosen, and the company was still standing. Part 6. The company Ford would have been. The most revealing part of this story is not the car Ford built. It is the company Ford chose not to remain. If the conservative alternative had been approved, Ford would have continued doing what it did best. It would have refined its platforms. It would have protected its margins. It would have delivered competence at scale. From the inside, very little would have felt different. There would have been no rupture in culture, no internal reckoning, no sudden influx of new expectations. The company would have moved forward comfortably, confident in its processes and validated by steady performance. That version of Ford would not have been broken. It would have been intact. And, over time, increasingly distant from the people it needed to reach next. Choosing the Mustang forced Ford to confront something uncomfortable. That the systems that created stability could also create inertia. That protecting identity too carefully can prevent it from evolving. This was not a lesson Ford sought deliberately. It emerged through consequence. By committing to a car that did not fit neatly into its own logic, Ford learned how much flexibility it actually had. It learned that not every decision needed to be fully optimized to be worth making. That realization changed internal conversations long after the Mustang itself evolved. It altered how risk was discussed. It expanded what kinds of projects could be entertained. It introduced the idea that relevance was something that had to be renewed, not assumed. The conservative car would have avoided that reckoning entirely. It would have confirmed existing beliefs rather than challenging them. Ford would have remained reliable, predictable, and increasingly peripheral to cultural change. Instead, the Mustang became proof that the company could step into uncertainty without losing itself. That proof mattered more than the car, because it established a pattern. Ford did not suddenly become reckless. It did not abandon discipline. It learned how to bend without breaking. The Mustang's imperfections were not a liability in this context. They were evidence that the company had accepted trade-offs consciously rather than denying them. That mindset carries forward. Organizations that only act when outcomes are guaranteed eventually stop acting altogether. Organizations that learn to manage ambiguity can move when the environment demands it. Ford, in this moment, chose the latter. That choice is why the Mustang story matters beyond nostalgia. It is not a tale of genius or inevitability. It is a reminder that progress often begins with rejecting the option that feels most comfortable. The car Ford almost built would have blended into the background of history. The decision Ford actually made changed how the company understood itself. And that is the deeper legacy of the Mustang. Not that it became iconic, but that it taught a large, disciplined organization how to change without losing coherence. That lesson did not announce itself. It revealed itself slowly, as all meaningful shifts do, through what Ford was willing to risk, and what it was no longer willing to settle for. Subscribe to Classic Wheels and Tales for long-form stories about the cars, the people, and the decisions that shaped automotive history. Each episode explores a moment where things could have gone another way and why they did not.